you members of the Baton Rouge Press Club. My name is John Couvillon, and for those of you who've not heard me speak before, I'm a pollster who lives here in Baton Rouge, and I've been in business for approximately 10 years, and I have thus far done business in 31 states, and my goal by the time I retire several decades from now is to be able to go to all 50, so 19 down, as they say. The reason I'm excited about being here today is that when I last spoke about a similar topic back in May, I did not have as much data with which to make an informed professional assessment of how the midterms are going, but now that primary season is over, there's a lot more blanks that can be filled in, so to speak, allowing me to speak in more detail and more authoritatively about what's going on nationally in 2018 and in Louisiana next year, which of course will be our statewide elections. What I think is important to discuss when we're talking about the midterm elections this year, I promise you a spin-free analysis. In other words, what I'm using is actual data, no spin, no supposition, just purely looking at the data and reporting on what I see. More specifically, when I'm looking at the midterm elections, there's several different data points I'm using that taken together can paint an accurate portrait of how I see the election this November going. The first thing that I think is important is when looking at actual voter registration data. In other words, ever since President Trump was inaugurated, are more people registering Democratic or registering Republican or some other answer? Because that to me is one of several indicators as to what Americans are thinking is how voter registration changes have occurred since he was inaugurated back in January 2017. So towards that end, I have looked at voter registration data in the 23 states that are kind enough to post the information online and have party registration and post such information online on a timely basis, because it runs the gamut from North Carolina, which posts on a weekly basis, to New York and Kansas, where you're lucky if you get it once a year. From looking at this data, out of a denominator of 94 million voters, I've actually seen very little evidence of a partisan wave. More specifically, what I've seen is that there are 795,000 less Democrats, there are 391,000 less Republicans, but what I find interesting is that unaffiliated and third-party voters, there are 956,000 more of them since President Trump was inaugurated. In my opinion, from looking at the voter registration data, we're not necessarily seeing partisan realignment. We're seeing really more partisan de-alignment because of the fact that you have declines in numbers of Republicans and Democrats and more independents registering. The next data point, which is more relevant and salient when looking at what I think is going to happen in November, is actually looking at what I would call partisan enthusiasm. The way I like to measure partisan enthusiasm is by looking over time at how many people participated in Democratic and Republican primaries across the country now that all the primaries are completed, except of course for Louisiana. When looking at primary partisan participation, when I last spoke in May, I only had Illinois and Texas data. Now I have 38 states with which to make a more complete assessment. Along those lines, I'm seeing much more examples of Democratic enthusiasm. The amateurish term I would use would be the enthusiasm's gone through the roof. More specifically, what I'm seeing is that in 2014, 55% of those participating in primaries nationwide voted in the Republican primary. This year, that 55% has decreased to 46%. And if you were to look at actual numbers, I'm seeing that compared to the 2014 midterm elections, the primaries that is, Democratic turnout is up 77%, Republican turnout is up 25%. And I'm seeing this happen almost consistently in each and every state of those 38 states that were included in my analysis. And I'm happy to say that this analysis just recently was posted on Ballotpedia, so if you're looking for additional data, it is posted out there now. And this was a project that is not for the faint of heart because, of course, it involves going to 38 different Secretary of State's offices and getting different quality of data in each. The reason I think that looking at this is a very important data point with regards to what a gauge is for partisan enthusiasm is that I do believe that partisan waves can be predicted and seen several months in advance of their actual occurrence. And as further proof of that, I went back into time to the 2014, 10, and 2006 midterm elections to get a gauge for what partisan turnout was, or rather, what the partisan percentage of the whole was in those midterm elections. In 2006, which was a Democratic year, 54% of those voting in primaries voted on the Democratic side. 2010 was a Republican landslide. 56% voted in the Republican primaries. 2014 was another landslide year. 55% chose a Republican ballot. This year, what I'm seeing is the same 54% Democrat that I saw in 2006. So that's one data point that I think can be used to determine what the level of partisan enthusiasm is. The next data point, which is also something I like to do, is in the states of Washington and California, they have open primaries similar to what we here in Louisiana have, the difference being that they don't go into December runoffs like we do, but I've looked over time at the primary results in those states, and again, I've seen that if you look at the past, you can see differences in partisan enthusiasm in those two states, kind of as a distant early warning, so to speak. More specifically, in Washington state, in the 2014 elections, Democrats had a 49 to 45% lead in terms of those who voted in the primary. This year, that 49 to 45 lead went to 60 to 36% Democratic, where the increase in Democratic turnout was 6 times that of what it was the Republican turnout. California was another interesting state where in 2014, voters preferred Democratic candidates by a 55 to 42% margin in the primaries. This year, that 55 to 42 has expanded to 63 to 34% Democratic, and in this case, Democratic turnout was more than 3 times. The increase in Democratic turnout was more than 3 times what it was the Republican turnout. That's actual election data, just like primary data across the country. Another data point which I think shows some evidence of what I see as increasing Democratic enthusiasm is by looking at early voting. Believe it or not, in several states, early voting is already underway. Absentee votes are being mailed back to Secretary of State's offices across the country and counted. One state that caught my attention was Georgia. 39,000 have returned their absentee ballots, and that's absentees. We're not even talking about in-person voting, which will be later this month, and of course here in Louisiana, it'll be in 22 days. In Georgia, what I saw was that 39,000 have already turned in their ballots, but the more salient data point to me was the fact that the black absentee balloting was 3 times what it was at a comparable period of time in 2014. So again, I'm seeing a heightened level of Democratic enthusiasm. Lastly, let's get to the fun stuff, which is my assessment of what I think will happen in the U.S. House and/or the U.S. Senate this fall. Towards that end, in addition to the data points I've just mentioned, I'm looking at polls, and in the case of Washington and California, I have actual election results to get an idea of what the partisan enthusiasm is. Looking at that data, one of the things I've seen happen over the years, particularly since the beginning of the Clinton administration, is voters are more likely to be straight ticket voters, meaning that the way they vote for president tends to have a very tight correlation to the way they vote in down ballot offices. Louisiana is a perfect example of that type of behavior, where in the old days, Louisianians would more likely than not vote for Republican presidential candidates, would rarely vote for Republican candidates down ballot. Nowadays, it's pretty much Republican across the board, at top of the ballot and down ballot. But more specifically, getting back to U.S. House races, given that there is an increasing prevalence of straight ticket voters, what I think would be a good indicator of what I think will happen to House districts this fall is by looking at the partisan performance in the 2016 presidential election. More specifically, what was the Trump and/or Hillary Clinton percentage in those 435 districts? From looking at that data set, I've determined that there are 153 congressional districts worth watching because their partisan lean was not strong enough to where a Democratic or Republican incumbent is safe from any kind of electoral reprisals. Of those 153 seats, 141 are held by Republicans and 12 held by Democrats. Within that group of 153, I've determined that there are 41 seats that are theoretically most vulnerable because either A, Donald Trump carried the district with a plurality or lost it, but a Republican incumbent holds it, or B, there are actually 4 instances in Minnesota and Pennsylvania where Donald Trump actually carried a district that voted for a Democratic congressman. Given that and various polling I've seen in U.S. House races around the country, I'm seeing an 11-seat Republican loss in the House with an additional 20 seats that I see as toss-ups. That is data I see from looking at part of the whole. In other words, polling data is only publicly available for 47 out of the 153 House seats, enabling me to make that assessment of an 11-seat House loss and 20 more toss-up seats. If I were to extrapolate what I saw to the entire list of 153 House seats, what I think the truer number is regarding partisan change in the November elections is a 23-seat Republican loss in the House with an additional 54 seats or toss-ups. Given that I'm seeing a lot of Democratic enthusiasm, my experience with prior landslides has been that toss-ups tend to all go one way or another. It happened in 1980 with Reagan. It happened in 1994 with the first Clinton midterms. Happened in 2010 and 14 with Obama, and so forth. That's what I see for the House. And given that the Republicans can only afford to lose a net of 23 seats, at best, I think they're skating on thin ice. At worst, I see this as a strong Democratic year, depending on what your point of view is. The U.S. Senate is a little bit different, given that you have a Senate class that is so top-heavy with Democrats that Democrats have a lot more exposure with this Senate class than do Republicans. Nevertheless, recent polling data I've seen is showing that right now, the 48 seats in the Senate would likely vote Republican, 44 Democratic, with 8 toss-ups, 5 of which are held by Democrats, 3 of which are held by Republicans. What that means, given that the Republicans have a 51-49 lead in the U.S. Senate, holding onto those 3 seats takes top importance. And then, of course, the Republicans have to be able to pick off a Democratic seat or 2 if they expect to maintain control of the Senate. So I would say that the Senate, in my opinion, is a toss-up at this point. As additional polling becomes available throughout the month of October, I can revise those assessments, which, by the way, I do post weekly on my blog site. The last thing before we talk about Louisiana, which I think is important to understand when we're talking about my assessment of the 2018 midterm elections, is understanding the proper context. The context being, of course, what do voters think? What do recent polls show is the Trump approval, the Congressional Job Approval, and how voters would vote in a generic partisan ballot between a Democratic or Republican candidate. So towards that end, the Donald Trump job approval is the weighted average of his recent job approval from polling is 46% positive, 52% negative. That 46% is awfully similar to the 46% that he received on Election Day in 2016, which suggests to me that he has a solid, relatively immovable base, which normally would be a good thing, except for the fact that 46% of the vote is short of 50%, number one, and number two, to win congressional seats, you do need to get a majority of a vote as opposed to majority of the Electoral College. Congressional job approval is 18% positive and 71% negative, meaning that if you're a challenger, particularly a Democratic challenger, or an independent challenger for that matter, it's easy for you to run against Congress right now given the low esteem with which voters hold it. Finally, the generic ballot, which is basically saying if you, without taking into account the name of an incumbent or the candidates, how would you vote today if the congressional elections were held? Would you vote for the Democratic or the Republican candidate? Recent polling there shows 48-41% Democratic lead. It's a lead that has really changed very little in the last few months. With early voting starting, basically the clock is running out with regards to trying to do anything to affect the midterm results. So I see, in conclusion with the federal part, I see this as a fairly strong Democratic year, and each additional data point I've seen, whether it be polling or election results, seems to further confirm what I've suspected ever since last November. When we get to Louisiana, Louisiana is an entirely different situation. For one thing, I would expect, and this is kind of a segue here, I would expect that all 6 congressional incumbents ought to win their primaries in November. I'd be very surprised if any of them, even Clay Higgins, went to a December runoff, because Louisiana, unlike the rest of the nation, has been steadily moving more Republican over time, and that movement, in my opinion, has accelerated ever since 2 events. Number 1, the Hurricane Katrina. Number 2, the BP oil spill in 2010. The context under which the Louisiana elections have to be viewed next year is this. Number 1, looking at the partisan lean. Number 2, looking at the challenges that Governor Edwards faces. The partisan lean is clearly showing a steady erosion in Democratic voter registration. More specifically, ever since Governor Edwards was elected back in the fall of 2015, there are 47,000 less Democrats, 77,000 more Republicans, and 22,000 more independents / unaffiliated / reform / green. I generically refer to them as independents. The part that I find most interesting, though, about those changes in partisan voter registration is, as far back as I've looked, and we're talking about going back into the 90s and 80s when the Secretary of State still has some data about partisan voter registration, I've seen a steady decrease in the number of white Democrats in the state. They once, of course, were most powerful and controlled just about everything when it came to elected offices. However, what I've seen ever since Governor Edwards was elected, I had mentioned that there are 47,000 less Democrats. There's actually 59,000 less white Democrats, which means in plain English that you have a Democratic Party nowadays that is black majority, and you also have white voter registration as plurality Republicans. So in other words, Louisiana along those lines is becoming more polarized from a partisan standpoint. So that's certainly a piece of background information that Governor Edwards has to appreciate as he faces a challenging 2019 reelection. The other thing that Governor Edwards has to contend with is this. He started off with a bad economy from when the oil prices crashed in 2014. Things are getting better, and I take the approach, if you talk about the law of oil prices, that once something like that comes down, like say it did in 1985-6 or 1989, 1998, or more recently 2014, I've noticed that those crashes tend to be quick and painful, but they also tend to reverse themselves over time. That, of course, is what's happening here in Louisiana. I'm of the opinion that the economy that Governor Edwards faces next year in his reelection will be better than what he faced in 2015. So that's certainly a benefit to him as the incumbent. The challenge he has, however, is that the budget fights that he's had with the Republican-controlled legislature ever since 2016, I think has not helped him with voters, because voters in this situation typically don't sort out who's right or wrong. They basically just see a lot of partisan fighting going on and blame everybody. A couple of additional challenges that Governor Edwards has, and this really has to do more with the legislature, is appreciating that the term limits legislation, which was passed via constitutional amendment in 1995, took full effect in 2007, and given that term limits refer to 12 years of service for a legislator, 2007 plus 12 is 2019, which means that that large class that was initially elected when a lot of incumbents had to retire, well, they're all going to be term limited next year. You've already had some people leaving, but there's still a lot more left to leave. And an additional dynamic that I think is occurring as we speak is that you've had, and according to my count, there have been 16 legislative vacancies ever since Governor Edwards was inaugurated. There's the prospect of up to 8 more vacancies this fall when you have legislators seeking other offices such as district judge, parish president, and so forth. Given that you have that much turnover going on, and that's even before we begin to talk about those who are going to be term limited next fall, you have the prospect of a lot of new legislators who have more of a partisan tact than they might have a generation ago. That's an additional challenge that anybody elected governor next year is going to have to face, is a lot of new legislators who may not necessarily march to the beat of the governor. We certainly saw that happen in 2015 when the leadership vote on the State House did not go the governor's way, and arguably that has made his life more difficult ever since he was inaugurated because, of course, he has to deal with a House leadership and committee chairs that are not necessarily favorable to his legislative agenda. So in conclusion, what I see happening, looking at 2018 and 2019, is this. In 2018, I see that it's going to be a very tough year for the Republicans. The question is, in my opinion, what the extent of the Democratic surge is going to be, but every piece of evidence I've seen shows it's going to be pretty big. And I'm talking 2006 and 2008 levels. Here in Louisiana, it's going to be somewhat different, where I think the governor is going to have a challenging re-election, where he's having to buck a basic Republican trend that's been going on in the state. And of course, you're going to have a lot of turnover in the legislature. So definitely it's going to be an interesting couple of years. And then of course, we have the 2020 presidential elections, which will similarly be interesting. So that's my presentation, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
Would the large number of turnover in the legislature mean that the people running for legislative seats would cause a roar against the governor of Republicans, and therefore he wouldn't just have his competitor, but also a roar from all legislators?
So the question being asked is what the partisan implications are of the turnover that's going to be affecting those elected to the legislature in 2019. The way I look at that is this: given that Louisiana is having more of a Republican trend, particularly in rural parishes that in the old days I would never have dreamed would have voted Republican, like say Avoyelles and Evangeline. So what that means in practical terms is in vacant legislative seats, which by the way are in Avoyelles and Evangeline, those seats are going to be more friendly to a Republican candidate than they would have in 2007 when Republicans made their first effort at trying to take control of the House. They didn't quite have their sea legs, in my opinion, in that election cycle. 12 years later, they will, and I would fully expect aggressive candidate recruiting by Republicans to add to their numbers in the House, maybe pick up one or two in the Senate, although their gains will be much more limited there.
You had a question that I think you mentioned on your blog. Does the governor deserve re-election? Could you tell us about the result of that? And also, the word deserve, I thought was kind of an interesting choice for your question. And so I'd be interested to talk about how you came to that.
Yes. So what Lanny is referring to is phraseology I used in one of my poll questions, a recent poll I did in the Secretary of State's race. What I like to do whenever I assess the health or lack thereof of an incumbent is, rather than beat around the bush with regards to what voters think about him or her, I basically ask the voters, do you think that he or she deserves to be reelected? In other words, I want to get to the heart of the matter as to what voters think. So in that poll question that Laney's referring to, Governor Edwards' deserve to be reelected question was 43 to 37 positive. More specifically, the detailed data showed that Governor Edwards has lost a lot of support amongst Republicans, although he still has some, particularly here in Baton Rouge. Governor Edwards has also lost strength among white independents. He still has strength among whites, Democrats, and blacks. So that's why, for those reasons, that I don't think that he'll necessarily be reelected by a 56-44 margin like he did in 2015 against a candidate who arguably had his issues and who faced a Republican Party that was far less than united. I don't think the Republicans are going to allow that to happen next year. And we saw a similar dynamic carry out in the Senate race in 2016 when the Republicans quickly closed behind, of course, John Kennedy, and the Republicans won in a landslide that December. So like I said, it's phraseology I like to use because I'm a believer of using sparse language that cuts to the chase. That's why I chose the words I did.
Have you done a poll for Kennedy run for governor?
So the question is if I've done a poll for Kennedy running for governor. The answer is I've done some polling. However, it is internal, and unfortunately I cannot talk about the contents.
What does internal mean in English? What does your answer internal mean?
It is information that I did not get permission to release it publicly.
Could you talk about your process a little? Because certainly in many recent elections, the polling was all wrong. because we don't know how to gauge public opinion these days. And what is your process?
Certainly. The question is about the process by which I do polling. And actually, this is a favorite subject of mine, in addition to the fact that I'm a pollster. So the first thing I'm going to do to answer your question is partially disagree with your initial assumption. More specifically, I actually wrote a post in my blog. It was back, I think, around November, December 2016, where I 60% disproved the notion that the quote-unquote the pollsters got it wrong in the presidential election. What's interesting about where the pollsters got it right or wrong was that when it came to national popular vote, the weighted average of polls in the last week of the 2016 campaign did show Hillary Clinton leading by 2 percentage points, which of course is the vote that she received, popular vote she received rather, in the presidential race. Where I saw polling misses was in 5 states, more specifically in the blue wall states that Donald Trump cracked. Each one of them is its own situation, where in the case of Wisconsin, I don't think you had any good late polling. In the case of Michigan and Pennsylvania, the numbers were moving towards President Trump, but given that it takes time to conduct a poll and work on the release and so forth, what should have been done, but for whatever reasons was not, was conducting a poll in that weekend before the Tuesday election and releasing the results on Monday rather. That largely didn't happen. So in other words, there were mishaps, but I don't think that they are to the extent as was popularly believed in the 2016 election. Given the fact that 80,000 votes in 3 states divided the election, you're talking about a very, very razor-thin election, meaning that a lot of pollsters got it wrong. So that's the general answer about the quote-unquote get it wrong part. Now, with regards to my process, it's a very good question, and I'll happily tell you, I'm of the opinion when doing a poll that I don't believe in random dialing, number one. Number two, I do not believe in registered voter polls. I do, however, believe in polls for voters that have demonstrated some kind of a likelihood to have voted in the past election or in the future election. Given that from research I've done, I've seen a fairly substantial amount of waste in a Louisiana voter file, I'm not interested in polling somebody who last voted in 2008 but is still in the voter rolls.
Still what?
But is still in the voter rolls. So basically what you're talking about is that I do a poll of the top 70%, so to speak, of the electorate. And from that, I'm most interested in sample composition. More specifically, what's the racial breakdown? What's the party breakdown? What's the geographic breakdown? What's the gender breakdown? Because I'm of the opinion with each additional data point you put in to make sure that the sample is representative of the population as a whole, your accuracy approaches 100% more and more and more, without, of course, ever getting there. Kind of like I always get it wrong, parabola? Yeah. So that's my philosophy of polling, is that I'm most interested in sample composition, number one. Number two, I'm interested in neutral questions that do not display any kind of bias, because if ever you've seen how someone could conduct a poll and show this result, someone can conduct a poll and show this result, my answer would be it's either one of two things, really one of three things. Either A, the sample composition, B, question placement, or C, the specific language that was used in a poll, because loaded language can push people towards one way or another. So I strive very hard to, anyway, it's a good question. But that's...
But I guess what I'm saying to you is, so you don't believe in random phone calls?
Of anybody.
Of anybody?
Of anybody.
So do you how do you actually contact people? Do you do it online? Do you do social media?
It's telephone poll. It's likely, what I'm referring to is rather than doing a telephone poll of all registered voters, I'm more interested in voters that have some degree of voter likelihood.
Right, so we've discovered, I guess, in just some random research that people don't have landlines anymore. So do you have trouble getting access to cell phones?
This is an interesting issue, and this is actually a trend that is affecting polling across the nation, in addition, of course, to just me. What's being referred to here is this. In the old days, it used to be that everybody had a landline and cell phones were prohibitively expensive. As time went on and cell phones became more available to the mass public, more and more people from a percentage basis got cell phones. Cell phones are very important in this regard. Federal rules prohibit auto-dialing cell phones. Cell phones can still be dialed, of course, through live operator means. And so what I found important when doing polling is that whenever and wherever possible, I do believe in including a sample of cell phones, because depending on the parish, I've seen anywhere from 20 to 50 or even 60% who have cell phones. In some areas, like say South Lafourche Parish, which is Ward 10, everything south of the Intercoastal Canal, pretty much everybody has a cell phone. You can't reach them through landlines. So my attitude about addressing the fact that the world is changing is that I do include a cell phone sample, and that cell phone sample percentage increases every year because, of course, that's what's happening to the general population. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get you next.
You mentioned there are about 1 million fewer Republican and Democrats. For the American public, how many Democrats are there and how many Republicans are there? And might we see a independent party, even if it's just independent?
So the answer is numerically how many Democrats there are and how many Republicans there are, and might we see the rise of the independents. The answer to the Democrat versus Republican question is contained right in here. I unfortunately don't have that number at the top of my head. With regards to independents, here's the challenge that they face. Independent to me is an all-encompassing term that could mean everything from Greens to socialists to libertarians to people who are truly apolitical. So there's really not a common banner under which independents can be reunited because they have, vastly different views on political issues. I've also found they tend to be less politically engaged. An interesting education I had when you're talking about independents, I had one preconceived notion about independence just from being here in Louisiana, where I was thinking of voters who basically are conservative but is not as politically engaged and really have more of a I don't like politics mentality. I had the opportunity a few years ago to do some focus group work in Oregon, and we were the guests, or rather the people who were invited to that focus group, were independents who lived in the suburbs of Portland. So I had one opinion of independents as being fairly conservative leaning. I get out to Oregon, and independents who, an entirely different category of voter who arguably could be voters here in the Garden District of Baton Rouge or in uptown New Orleans in terms of their political leaning. So like I said, independents to me are multiple flavors, and what their political leanings are is highly dependent on where they live. And that is also the challenge that independents face, because if you are an independent running, what would be that unifying platform you have that would attract all people who are disaffected with both the major parties? You can certainly talk about dislike of incumbents, some reforms in the name of transparency that need to be made by like what Ross Perot did in 1992, 1996. But sooner or later, you do have to take positions on issues. And so that's going to be the challenge that independents face going forward, is finding that kind of common thread. Gary Johnson certainly tried to be a viable independent, and I think had he been invited to the debates, he could have cracked 5%, but of course he ended up getting 3%.
We're going to follow up on Beth's question.
Certainly.
Two, how do you get the cell phones? And then secondly, do you think there are problems with automated polling?
So the question here is, number one, how do you get cell phones? Number two, what are the problems with automated polling? Very good questions. I'll happily answer both of them. Cell phones, you get them through the voter rolls. In other words, when a person registers to vote, he or she may put down a landline or a cell phone for his or her number. So that's accessing the cell phones. It's just like accessing a normal voter. With regards to what the second question? Automated, yes. Since I do both types of polling, so I feel that I can talk comfortably about either side of the fence, which is automated versus live. That is this: automated polling has gotten a bad rap, but I think there's as many good things as you can say about it as bad things. What I think, though, is the more appropriate answer about which type of poll is better is what the client wants. Such as if it's a very long survey, and I did one time, those 28 questions, I would never recommend that be an automated survey. Also, too, I found that those in traditional news media tend to think that only live polling is legitimate. What I think causes automated polling to get a bad rap is that you have a lot of people in the quote-unquote polling business who basically throw a bunch of numbers in the file, and whatever comes out, that's what they report as the quote-unquote poll results, without doing any objective analysis as to whether the sample is representative of the population as a whole. I think that is the bad rap that automated polling has gotten. But if you think about automated technology and in terms of it being mainstream, you want to get credit card balance or you need to talk to your doctor or whatever, what are you going to be going through? A touch-tone menu. So that is very similar, in fact, to what automated polling is, only the difference is that it's a pre-recorded script where you have the option of picking a candidate. So I think of automated polling as more of multiple choice types polling, whereas live polling tends to be more appropriate, provided the client has the budget, of course, more appropriate for longer polls, and if you need open-ended answers to questions, more of the essay format as opposed to the multiple choice format, as it were. Of course, I would like to also give a note of caution for those who think that there's some magic elixir in open-ended answers. You'd be amazed at just the random, incomprehensible randomness that comes out if you ask someone a question and you write down verbatim what they say, which means that the pollster has the unenviable task of trying to make some sense and do some aggregation in terms of what the responses are. So either is appropriate depending on the circumstances.
And on the cell phones, you're getting them from voter registration records, but you don't know if they're cell phones.
What you have to do is there's also a cell phone, there's also services that go through and look at a file of phone numbers and determine if that's a landline or cell phone.
So you're looking at a particular percentage of those cell phones, or?
Particular percentage, my attitude about that is there's a particular percentage I think is appropriate given clients' budget requirements and given whether I think it is representative of the population as a whole. But other than that, my attitude is, you know, a cell phone can be identified from external third-party vendors, and you just make sure that when you construct a poll that you have an appropriate percentage of landlines and cell phones. Lanny?
You talked about turnout nationally and the indicators there, but we set kind of what was considered a record low in turnout last year.
We did.
A statewide special. Is the same prospect in view for this November?
It's not, and the reason I don't think that's the case is this. You have to understand the context of the elections last year versus the elections this year. Last year was a special election cycle, which special election cycle, and more specifically for a down ballot race that not very many people were enthusiastic about. And other than the mayoral race in New Orleans, you didn't really have much else on the ballot to get voters out to the polls. This year, what's a little bit different is, number one, it's a federal election cycle, so you have 6 congressional races. You also have school board races in virtually every parish. And of course, you have some local races like special elections for state representatives, some judicial races and all that. Given the totality of all those races that's occurring, there is going to, of course, be efforts by the candidates to make sure voters know that, hey, there's an election out there, and therefore I think that'll drive the turnout up. Now, if you want to get into numbers, my thought is this. The last time in Louisiana we had a midterm election where there was not a Senate race on the ballot was in 2006, when we had the insurance commissioner and secretary of state had a special election. And by the way, that was in the aftermath of Katrina, as a side note, parenthetical side note. In that election cycle, even with people displaced from Katrina, you still had approximately 30% voter turnout. A number around that level is what I think is appropriate in terms of predicting turnout this fall. And of course, if you and I were having this discussion on October 24th or 5th after early voting has started, I'll have a firmer idea of what I think ultimate turnout will be. But given that we're not there yet, I do think that the 30% metric from 2006 would probably be a good yardstick to use for this year's turnout. Yes?
Of the amount of people that you try to contact for polling, how many do you actually successfully make contact with? And of that amount, how many normally consent to being polled?
So basically what we're talking about here is you're calling people, and what kind of response rate do you get? It's pretty low. And in fact, what I think is really illustrative of the quote-unquote pretty low, you've probably seen that the New York Times has partnered with Siena College to do 100 U.S. house polls across the nation. And one of the things they've done, which I think is a really fascinating education about polling and really the ins and outs of polling, is they're publishing the number of calls it took and the number of respondents. And so if you do a quick division, you could see the response rate. And so it's certainly not like the old days when there was some statistics I saw from a generation ago where basically for every 100 people you would call, you would get about 30 respondents, which, I mean, to me, that's heaven. It's single digits now, and my attitude about it is that can be problematic if you're talking about smaller jurisdictions. More specifically, in Louisiana terms, if you're talking about smaller than a state representative district, that's when I have the conversation with the client about, given that you want me to poll, just to use an example, the city of Central, or say a parish council race in Tangipahoa, given the number of callable households there are, I can only promise you XYZ sample size. So I always make sure to put that caveat in once you start polling smaller jurisdictions, because it very much does matter in those smaller jurisdictions.
Okay, one last one. Given the polarization in the country, there's also a polarization in the political business, whether consulting and polling.
Yes.
Do you typically poll for Republicans or Democrats? Or
Typically.
Still one of the old ones who is?
Typically Republicans. But my attitude is this: in politics, I think all of us have a shared love of the sport, and yes, it is a sport. Theater, to be exact. And so my attitude is that all of us in the political profession, whether we be Democrats or Republicans, have a shared love of the sport, and to think that the other side is inherently evil, to me, is a big mistake and also contributes to the polarization that we're seeing nationally. So I take the approach that when that question comes up, I'm always forthright I'm always transparent about my political views, and 99 times out of 100, I find it doesn't really matter with potential clients.
We have time for one more question.
Let's see.
You mentioned Katrina.
Yes.
Which is President Bush and Good Work Brownie and FEMA. And then you mentioned the BP oil spill, which would be Obama and a corporate mistake.
Yes.
And that moved Louisiana towards Republican. Are those just data points, or could you explain how that would move Louisiana towards Republican?
The question is why I specifically identified Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill as events that were arguably tipping points in terms of Louisiana's political leanings. One of the things I saw happen after Katrina was this. Some of this is speculation, some of this is hard data. The speculation part is this. Democrats controlled every statewide office in August of 2005 because, of course, you remember that was right after the untimely death of Fox McKithen. So Democrats controlled every statewide office. They controlled the state house, the state senate. What I saw happen after Hurricane Katrina, and it was not for the reasons you would think, but what I saw happen after Hurricane Katrina, all of a sudden Democrats stopped being viable from a statewide perspective. In other words, you'd start having Republicans run and win with a greater degree of frequency, where before that, it's almost like a BC and an AD, where before 2005, Republicans were constantly stuck at 47% of the vote if they had a serious candidate. After Katrina, I saw a much greater likelihood of Republicans winning. The other side of the coin after Katrina, too, is you'll notice the sheer volume after Katrina and after the BP oil spill of people switching parties. That's tapered off since then, but around that time in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we were having people almost on a daily basis switching parties, and that actually is what caused the state house and the state senate numerically to become Republican majority. Was after the 2010 Republican landslide, lots of Democrats in the legislature saw 2011 coming and they started changing parties. Now, with regards to the BP oil spill, what I think happened there was this. You had a lot of ancestral Democrats who lived in those coastal parishes, and oil and gas was important to their livelihood regardless of their political views. However, when you had a president who flippantly told them that they could collect unemployment, even though that they were going to be out of work for several months because of the moratorium, I did see tremendous shifts in partisan sentiment in those coastal parishes towards the Republicans. And so that's why that my contention is that those two events were kind of inflection points if you're talking about Louisiana's political complexion change, because before then, The thing about Louisiana is things happen here at a glacial pace. We were the last state to become majority Republican, but the change has occurred slowly enough to where I would be surprised if it were to flip back for the next few decades. One more?
What do you think Kavanaugh's impact is going to be on the Senate?
Judge Kavanaugh, I'm glad you asked that question. My opinion about the Kavanaugh nomination is this. I don't think that the nomination is going to change partisan alignments as they exist today. The last 4 words I said are I'm parsing words here. The as they exist today, let me explain that a little bit more. I look at the political leanings of Americans in this way. 46% voted for President Trump, 48% voted for Hillary Clinton, and another 6% voted third party or another candidate. I've not seen any evidence that President Trump has picked up support from the 54% that voted against him. So you have this situation where you have President Trump, and in polling I've done, President Trump does very, very well amongst Republicans. However, huge drop-off amongst independents and Democrats. So given that you have this solid 45% of the vote that's not going anywhere, they, of course, it's almost like it's 2 different worlds if you look at the comments and social media about what people think about Judge Kavanaugh. In other words, if you're talking about those with a Republican partisan leaning, it's all a case of, George Soros and, this person was caught eating dinner with Hillary Clinton 2 weeks ago, therefore there's a connection there, and so on and so forth. Conversely, if you were to look at those on the Democratic side, of course, every misdeed that Kavanaugh ever did has suddenly been brought forth to light. So in other words, opinion's not really shifting on either point, but I do think, though, that for the critical segment of independent voters, that they're not really being given a reason to support Republicans, and they dislike the partisan wrangling that's going on in Washington right now, and I think that affects their opinion for November. Now, with the Kavanaugh nomination, I see one of 2 things happening. Either A, Mike Pence casts the tie-breaking vote, or B, you're going to have multiple Republican defections at one time. A lot depends on what comes out of this FBI investigation. The challenge with such a narrow confirmation, however, is that given how, in my opinion, partisan alignments are solidifying more and more every day, especially with at least 39,000 people already voting, that I think that opinions on Kavanaugh are also going to be indicative of what opinions are going to be in the general election in November, and that's not good if you need those crucial independents to win.
So there could be a turnover on the Senate statewide?
It's possible, especially since you have 8 toss-up seats. That's a lot. And so, this is honestly one of those types of questions I would love you to ask me a week from now when I could start seeing, there's pollsters out in the field right now. As the results come in throughout the week, it'll be interesting to see what the delta is with regards to those Senate races. Unfortunately, I don't yet have that information to give you a more complete assessment, but I do think, though, that the Kavanaugh nomination per se is not going to switch voters other than existing partisan alignments today.